We have our eyes closed.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sectoral Forum on Reimagining the Future of Transport. Each of us is deeply connected to transport. Think back to those happy memories as a child, when maybe you had your first train ride or first airplane ride, or just the joy of getting a bike for your birthday. All of these are the places where our connection with transportation really begins. Today, we use it for a number of things, whether it is to get groceries, to go for a vacation with family, or even going to work on a daily basis. Transport, as we know it, is changing. And in this session, we want to look at the different transitions that are happening. We want to understand how we can design transportation systems to be more people-centered. And it is my pleasure to invite the moderator for this session, Dr. Anne Gibbs. Dr. Gibbs is the CEO of the Asset Management Council in Australia. She is an executive management professional with expertise in infrastructure. She has worked around the world with a diverse range of communities to find solutions around aging water assets, transport, and social infrastructure. She has also been advising the CDRI on various projects. Over to you, Dr. Anne.
Thank you, Dr. Hem, for that very kind introduction. And yes, transport systems do provide access for people and goods, and they underpin the economy of the country. And this session will cover perspectives on transitions happening in the transport sector, as well as discuss the opportunities for integrating disaster and climate resilience of infrastructure. The session will be divided into three parts. Firstly, we will be treated with a special address that will bring an international perspective on infrastructure transition within transport across the European Union. Then we will focus on roads and railway systems with three of our panellists in a moderated type discussion with questions and answers. And then our third part, we will be focusing on the airport infrastructure, again with a moderated discussion amongst three of our panellists with questions and answers. The CDRI team has assembled an expert and knowledgeable and diverse panel of 7 people from various countries across the globe and various transport sectors who will be able to provide different perspectives to our discussion. We are working in a hybrid mode with some of our panellists on site in the studio in Delhi and the others online. We would also like to make this an interactive session, and we'll be asking some poll questions as we go. So please have your phones ready to participate in the polls. There is also an opportunity to post questions from the audience to the panel. So please type any questions you may have in the chat box. And as time permits, we will pose them to the expert panel. So now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Giorgio Traviani, who is Head of Programme at Europe's Rail Joint Undertaking. He is currently responsible for the €1.2 billion Europe's Rail R&I integrated programme. Previously, he was supervising head of R&I for the €920 million R&I programme of Shift to Rail. He has been a senior corporate advisor at UNIFE, advising on strategic topics and preparing S2R. In 2007, as senior technical manager, he supervised several R&I projects, teams, and technical committees. He was also secretary of ERRAC. In 2006, he assisted Mr. Costa, chairman of Transport Committee of the European Parliament, and in 2004, he worked for the European Chamber of Commerce Association and the Val d'Aosta Regional Representation Office. Prior to that, he worked for Procter & Gamble in Rome and for BNP Paribas Cardiff in Paris. He holds an engineering degree and a master's degree in public affairs. Over to you, Mr. Giorgio Travagliani.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It is my pleasure today to be here with you. I don't need to present myself because you know everything about my life right now, I think. Thank you very much, Anne. And I will go directly into the subject, and please allow me in the few minutes I have to share my presentation. So 1 second, I will just share. Okay, it was shared for me perfectly. Okay, so what I would like to discuss with you today, it's about how reimagining the resilient transport of the future. And we have in the Europe's Rail Joint Undertaking already taken a step towards this. And you can see also in this initial introductory slide what is the mission statement of the Europe's Rail Joint Undertaking, which is making true rail research and innovation, railways and everyday mobility. And the key factor in it is for sure the resilience of our system, and our system, so the rail system, is interconnected also with other transport modes, and therefore we need a system approach also for this. If we move on with the presentation, I will show to you in the next slide how we started with it. So we work together with the European Commission because Europe's Rail is a public-private partnership. So the public part of Europe's Rail, it's the European Union represented by the European Commission, and the private part represents the industry at large, including operating companies, infrastructure managers, universities, etc., and of course supply industry, to look that are also part of our private member. And together we have identified what are the key challenges in the rail transport. You can see there, I will not go into the detail in the interest of time, but all those are interconnected. And there is, of course, one common line is the rail system needs to be resilient, need to work in order to provide an answer to all those challenges. If we go on, and in the next slide, you will see that we build up on these challenges clear policy objectives. These policy objectives are the European Union policies objectives. And in there, we clearly have also one clear objective being defined on delivering a sustainable and resilient rail system. If we go in the next slide, you will see that we started to identify which areas of research and innovation can deliver upon those EU policy. So not only having EU policy that define the way to go, but having instruments in order to apply those EU policies. And of course, making innovation and applying this innovation, it will be key. So we have identified 5 areas. I will detail a little bit more later on those 5 areas. But what is important is that those 5 areas will deliver technological solution that will transform the way how we operate the rail system. And it is a system, as you can see here in this slide. It is about working with interconnected subsystems. And this is already a picture that shows to you the difficulty that we will have in and the challenge in managing a complex system of systems. But in addition to that, we need to interconnect with other transport modes. If you go to the next slide, you will see that we have identified as well some specific targets. Around those targets, there are numbers because we need to quantify that. So we're not doing just research for research, but we're doing research in order to achieve a specific target on cost reduction, on increase harmonization, competitiveness, capacity, and resilience. In the next slide, you will see our integrated program. So in order to achieve all those objectives, and you find a summary on the left, in the European Union, we have identified a structured approach in order to deliver this. First of all, the system pillar, it's where we are going to define an architecture of the rail system with clear specification. And in there, the resilience will also play a key role, because we will need to ensure that whatever architecture we're putting into place for the rail system, it's able to sustain every type of disruption. Similarly, we have the innovation pillar. In the innovation pillar, we have those 5 research and innovation areas I mentioned to you before. And I will focus in a few of them. For example, the traffic management. We would like to deliver a European traffic management system, interconnected. And you can easily imagine that when there is a disruption in the rail system, a key part of the resilience is the ability to quickly find a new path and to quickly reallocate the resources. So this is something which will be key. And how we're going to do that? Digitalization will help us, because this is the key part of the initiative, is to look into how digitalization will enable to be also more resilient. And similarly, also with the sustainable and digital assets, which is the 3rd area, the idea is to build up also digital twin of the physical assets that we already have, in order to predict, for example, their remaining life, and in order to anticipate the maintenance need, so that all the system become more resilient. And this is done not only, of course, for passenger, but also for freight. So a lot of focus of this innovation will also happen on the freight businesses, which include logistics. Also, if we're thinking of resilient system, we need to think bigger than just rail, because it's an entire chain, logistic chain of actions in order to deliver, for example, the goods at the destination. And with all these, the 3rd pillar of this integrated research and innovation program is the deployment group. We will define migration path, but those migration path needs to be implemented. And this is a key topic. As I mentioned before, we're not doing just research for research. We're coming up to the highest technological readiness level, but then we want to implement those solutions. So it is key also that member states and governments take up those research output and make them all their own initiatives at member state level. And so this is also why we're having a lot of focus on this deployment group. And then if you go to the next slide, which is my last slide for this opening, there is something I haven't mentioned, but it is key. In order to make railway, like any other transport mode and everyday mobility, we should think user first. And user first, user don't want to get stuck, if I'm speaking of rail, in the middle of nowhere with the train not running. So the solution must be resilient. The solution must be resilient in front of the challenges we have, climate change, increase of demographic, and so on and so forth, energy situation, etc. But in the design of the system, we needed to start to think about how the user will use the system and how the user will use the services. And this is very much important, because I see my years of investment in research and innovation, that engineers are very good to solve problems, but sometimes the problems are farther away and maybe are not yet known. So a user thinking approach will help us also to prevent this, and ultimately to deliver a more sustainable and resilient transport solution. Having said that, my conclusion, my initial address is terminated here. What I really hope is that in the next presentation, we will hear what other transport modes and also in the rail sector has been done in terms of increasing resilience. And my message is also to all of you that we're ready to cooperate with you. So this is really a partnership initiative at European Union level that will deliver technical solution, but also standards. And so we can cooperate, for example, with CDRI and any other organization in the standard settings and making sure that we have overall a better resilient solution for the transport. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giorgio. That was a very inspirational address to open up and set the scene, focusing on the user first and also the interconnectedness when you're looking at a very complex system. I'd now like to sneak in a poll question. Please, if Tom can put that up, please, for the audience to participate. So the question is, in your view, which is the most important factor shaping the future of transport? And there's four options there: urbanisation trends, advanced technologies, energy and resources, disaster and climate risks. So while that poll question is being answered, I'd like to move on to our second part of the session, which is focusing on the roads and railway systems and carrying on from our keynote address here. So the three panel members that I'd like to invite to this section would be Emma, John and Suzanne. And each of them I would be asking on the transition of the future of transport infrastructure to provide some opening remarks and also addressing some of the outcomes of the keynote special address. So I'd like to start with Emma, and if I could introduce Dr. Emma Ferranti. Dr. Emma Ferranti is an associate professor at the University of Birmingham, undertaking interdisciplinary research at the intersection of infrastructure, the built environment and green infrastructure. Her EPSRC fellowship examines how nature-based solutions can deliver infrastructure resilience to extreme weather and climate change. She's a member of the Infrastructure Operators Adaptation Forum that brings together government, senior officials and the Climate Change Committee to share best practice on weather and climate risk to UK infrastructure. Emma was an invited author of the infrastructure chapter of the 2021 Independent Assessment of UK Climate Risk. She's also an advocate for urban greening and co-facilitates the Trees and Design Action Group, a network and charity which brings together individuals and organisations from wide-ranging disciplines to improve knowledge and good practice for the benefit of urban trees. Emma, I invite you to provide some opening your remarks.
Hi, Anne. Can you hear me okay? So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today. It's a real privilege to be here among such great panelists and part of this excellent conference that CDRI have curated. I very much enjoyed Giorgio's speech. I'm really interested in how the European Rail Traffic Management System and improved digitalisation will help increase rail resilience. And I also absolutely believe that, you know, transport is there for the people. And I fundamentally believe that good public transport is a really important part of addressing inequalities and inequities in our cities and should be kind of the focus of many of the levelling up programmes that we have in our towns and cities across the world. Thank you. I look forward to the discussions as they continue.
Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Mr. John Hardwick. John is the Executive Director of the Asset Management Branch at Transport for New South Wales and is responsible for leading and enabling transport service outcomes for customers and communities through effective whole-of-life asset management. John was previously the Executive Director, Sydney Division for former Roads and Maritime Services, where he led the division's first strategic asset management plan and the implementation of full battery electric vehicles into Sydney's division's passenger fleet. John has a background of over 30 years in asset management within the electricity and transport industries, is a passionate leader of organisational improvement in assets and operational risk management, and has implemented world-class asset management strategies and systems to manage risk and provide value for customers and communities. John is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and serves as a board member for numerous global and Australian asset management organisations. I'd like to invite you, John, for some remarks, please. I think you're on mute, John.
I am, Anne. Thank you very much. And thank you, Giorgio, for that great keynote. It really encapsulated where we, I think, needed to have a conversation around resilience. And in my opening remarks, I think I'd like to set the scene of what's happened in Australia over the last 3 years. And some of you may or may not know, but certainly for us, resilience now is front and centre of everything that's done across Australia. So in the past 3 years, we've had bushfires, we've had floods, we've had major storms which have washed away homes, we've had landslips, cyber attacks, and when you add to that, COVID happened just in the middle of all of that. Resilience and customer focus is one of the key things that's happened. 3 years ago, we revamped transport and brought together roads, rail, light rail, buses, ferries, and active transport all into one place so that we could manage the customer outcome. I think Giorgio and Emma were very focused on customer outcome as well. I think it's no use having a service that's resilient if getting there or getting off that service to where they need to be isn't resilient. So for us, there's been a lot of work to bring whole of government together and to make sure that the transport network is actually servicing the needs of the community. So we've started with the needs of the community, and now the focus and some of the things I'll talk about as we go through this session is really the things we've done to bring ourselves to a position where we can better serve the communities of Australia, but also connect people together and make sure we do deal with issues around freight, human movement, and life as part of that. So thank you, Anne. There's just a couple of opening comments.
Thank you, John. And now I'd like to move to Dr. Suzanne Ross and introduce Suzanne. She's the Advisor and Chief of Knowledge Management at the Asian Development Bank. And Suzanne's team launched Asian Development Bank's first Futures Thinking and Foresight program, ADB's first Technology Innovation Challenge, ADB's bank-wide innovation hub, and led the design of ADB's new Knowledge Management Action Plan, which supports the implementation of ADB's Strategy 2030. She launched the first ADB Health Bond, developed the first digital health flagship program, championed health impact assessment across sectors, and supported ADB's first private sector investments in health sector companies and equity funds. She advises WHO on foresight, digital health, innovation, and knowledge management, and collaborates regularly with the National University of Singapore, Duke, on knowledge events. I'd like to now invite Suzanne to provide some opening remarks on the keynote, and especially focusing on the transition of the future of transport infrastructure. Over to you, Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So you might wonder why I'm here, and I speak really as the knowledge manager of the ADB. And I think what is remarkable and what is important to say, and to link that also to the keynote, is that our previous concepts, especially from multilateral development banks, development institution in general, that was to invest in infrastructure and in roads and build these roads, is now moving to understanding better how are we investing actually in mobility of people, how are we investing in systems, and what kind of investments do we need to build capacity to work differently, as we've heard from the keynote speech from Giorgio in the beginning, and also how we actually connect with different sectors across the transport sector, right? And as you can imagine, this is a real challenge. It's a challenge in governments. It's a challenge from Europe to Asian countries. But it's also a challenge actually in development organizations, because there you also have to now break the silos of sectors and themes, right? We are talking a lot about users, but then you have to enhance the understanding of the diversity of users also when we speak to the engineers. So I think we're looking forward, there's actually a lot of need for knowledge management to bring together different perspectives, different worldviews, to then, of course, work with the users. I mean, this is where futures thinking comes in. What kind of transport sector will we need in the future? For whom will we need it? And I think then last but not least interesting is, of course, also in a way the dilemma. Do we now invest in decarbonizing the transport sector, which we have, or do we now really also invest in connecting the last mile and investing in the rural road systems, which is often, still not developed? I give you one example. I live in the Philippines, and just to get to a city 180 kilometers away, it takes you 14 hours. So these are, I think, the different challenges we are facing as we reimagine the transport sector.
Thank you, Suzanne. Just the results of the poll didn't really provide us with any insights there, with all the four aspects being highlighted. So let's move now to the first question to the panel. I'm going to ask the questions to the panel in the same order that we've just heard from them. So the question is, the world is reimagining the future of transport. How do we plan for the climate and disaster resilience of transport infrastructure? So Emma, how would you like to start us off, please?
Thanks. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Lovely. So in terms of planning for climate and disaster resilience, the first slide I wanted to share with you shows a framework for adapting to weather and climate change. And this was actually developed for low-income countries as part of a project funded by UK Aid. And the project team interviewed transport operators working in Africa and Asia. We reviewed academic and grey literature, and we used this information to create the framework, which is supported by a policy guide. And the links for the policy guide and the supporting knowledge report will be provided in the chat. In terms of the framework, the first step establishes the scope. It thinks about the different modes of transport from the start of the journey to the end of the journey and the different scales involved. And it also thinks about the hazards that those transport modes might experience and the stakeholders who need to be included. The second step within the adaptation framework considers the data available to understand the impact of current weather and future weather and climate on those transport modes, and thinks about whether you have data or whether you need to collect that data or whether you need to work with others to obtain and interpret the data that you need to understand the impact on your infrastructure. In the third step, we explain how you can review the different options and solutions in order to adapt to climate change. We recommend an adaptation pathways approach that helps you plan for the future, but it also acknowledges the uncertainties of climate change and the other socio-economic variables. And the policy guide provides some links through to great work done by other organisations such as Deltares, who I saw presenting earlier on in the conference. The final step in the framework considers funding and implementation, and it speaks about the importance of monitoring and reporting on the success of your implementations, because adaptation is an iterative process, and it's really important to understand the progress that you are making as you kind of go around the cycle and you feed into the next step of adaptation options and move forward in time. In terms of good examples from the UK, I'd like to share some work that's been undertaken by Network Rail. Network Rail are the UK railway infrastructure operators and owners, and they've been working on their adaptation strategy for over 10 years now. And they initially began in 2011 working with stakeholders, including the Met Office, academics, and other partners, in order to understand the impact of current weather and future climate on the railway network. They did this at a regional level, and they produced a series of weather resilience and climate change adaptation plans, which were for a period of 2016 to 19. They then reviewed these and produced a new set of plans from 2019 to 2024. And these action plans link specific, so these adaptation plans have specific actions that link to budgets and the control periods. And so increasingly, weather resilience and climate change adaptation is becoming embedded within Network Rail. And as part of their long-term planning, they're now developing some adaptation pathways for the future as they move through the next step of their cycle. So that's all for me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Now I'd like to invite John Hardwick to provide some examples from New South Wales in Australia. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Anne. And I think, Anne's, in that respect, Emma's given a good framework for us to discuss within this. If I look in where I started from when I started the conversation around what had happened to us over the last 3 years, really importantly, we've taken that at a whole of government level and a whole of society level, both in New South Wales and Australia, and we've started to produce, well, we have produced in July last year, a resilience strategy, which was looking across how can transport become more resilient in a way that actually meets the expectations of the community. So it started a community first aspect to it, but then also making sure it connects. We're doing two pieces of work together, climate change, and we're looking at climate change from now to 2050 and 2060 and saying what's happening in climate change, and then also looking at our resilience strategy to make sure that the resilience strategy connects to that. The key components of that strategy is actually three parts: strategic, tactical, and operational. And it really, the advocation within that is when we're doing planning and strategic planning for future transport services or needs of the community, to make sure that resilience is actually built in. So the strategy is informing the policies, which will then inform the standards that we're now starting to implement to achieve that outcome. So what do we need to build in a resilient sense against the emerging climate change threats? And when a business case for investment or a new way of doing something comes forward, it needs to be very clear as to how it's managing those issues. That's at the strategic level. At the tactical level, looking at all the existing transport operational assets and looking at what are the needs and what are the things that can have the biggest impact on the community to the threats that are there today. And certainly, as we've seen over the last 3 years, the threats of today are now becoming quite well known to us, but they're potentially only going to get worse. When you have 5 1-in-100-year events within 3 years, you start to go, they're no longer 1-in-100-year events. Things have changed forever. And that's for us now working out how to deliver on that. And then the last component of the resilience strategy is very much the operational, making sure that our emergency and crisis response plans and processes and teams and the way in which people work together across all the different parts of government and the community and assess their readiness for climate change and look at the risks and likelihood and severity and make sure we're improving our emergency responses. So for us, the strategy is setting the framework within now which we're working to get the right policy positions and the right standards in place. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, John. And now to Dr. Susan. If you could provide us with some examples from ADB countries, please.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, we are doing increasingly, and as we are moving now to fully aligning our transport operations with the Paris Agreement, it will become mandatory to do climate and disaster risk assessments at the beginning. Of course, we do that also at the sector level. And to give some examples, so one example is the Cambodia Rural Roads project, where we actually combined, number one, a people-centered approach, a nature-based approach, and through these approaches built over 500 kilometers of rural roads in Cambodia. I think that's a good example. If we look at urban development and urban roads, we have a lot of work in the People's Republic of China going on, where we are building healthy and nature-based cities. We call them also sponge cities. That's another example. A good example on where we are learning from disasters is the work in Indonesia, where, for example, the recent earthquake 2018 in Lombok, that kind of enabled a lot of more disaster resilient infrastructure that was built now, especially in the port area. And maybe another good example is in Tonga, where also after a disaster there recently, not the volcano, before, the way we rebuilt the port and the infrastructure around the port was really taking an adaptive approach and a resilient approach. Obviously, the port cannot be built at a level yet what the sea level might rise to, but it provides in a modular approach the ability to adapt. So these approaches are being taken up. Of course, and I think this is also what this coalition is for, and this forum is, we need a lot more advocacy and awareness raising on the importance to do these kind of upstream assessments, and also kind of be honest that often we don't know what will happen and how the pathway will develop. So I think a lot of iterative approaches, and there comes back the challenge to enhance knowledge management capacity, because a lot will depend on maintenance and operations, right? How is this maintained? What kind of support do we have to understand impacts of disaster and weather changes? So I'll stop here, and please do visit the ADB booth, because you will find a lot more examples there.
Thank you, Susan. So in summary there, we have Emma that provided us with a terrific framework that could be used. And then we have the resilience strategy that has been implemented in New South Wales around the strategic, the tactical and the operational elements. So hoping to get the policies and the infrastructure standards set. And then we have all those lovely examples from the Asian Development Bank. And I liked your last comment around the need for the maintenance and the operations that needs to be taken care of. Now I'd like to move to the second question. And again, I'm going to pose that to the three people that we have on our panel, Emma, John and Susan, in the same order. And the question is, could you share examples of people-centred approaches towards building resilient transport infrastructure? Emma, would you be able to answer that one, please?
Thanks, Anne. I'm just going to share my screen again. Thanks again for this opportunity to speak. I'm going to take a bit of a step back to answer this question. I think a people-centred approach is particularly important in our urban areas, where weather and climate resilience is intrinsically linked to urban design and the way that people move around the city. I wanted to share some work that we've done in Rio de Janeiro with collaborators based in the city. Over a few years, we interviewed a range of different stakeholders, including transport practitioners, resilience experts, academics and transport users. And we went to Rio because it's made some really great steps forward as part of the Resilient Cities Network. It has a new and really fantastic centre of operations that coordinates daily operations and disaster response. It also integrates transport operations during disaster management. And it's also worked with harder to reach communities located within favelas to provide weather alerts. But Rio is a city that struggles with the impact of extreme weather, particularly heavy rainfall. And as such, I think it provides a really neat example of situations that we see worldwide. On my slide, I show the map of high capacity transport routes through the city. Red is rail, blue is metro, and green is bus rapid transit, BRT. And every day, these transport networks bring people from all over the city and the wider metropolitan region into two really small concentrated areas, the central zone and the southern zone, to access employment in the port or in the CBD or as part of the tourism and service sectors. And this creates this pendulum movement. You move people into the city and out of the city. And as a consequence of the city growth and the topography, you have this real concentration of transport modes in the northern corridor, which is highly urbanized, it has insufficient drainage, and it's really susceptible to flooding following heavy rainfall. And so you have regular and repeated disruption to transport services due to flooding, or you can have indirect transport disruption because neighborhood flooding prevents people from being able to reach the transport stations or to exit the transport stations. And so bringing this back to the people-centred approach, you wouldn't design a transport system like this, but this is the situation that we have in many of the cities around the world. And transport should be there to facilitate the movement of people And in cities around the world, it's often those transport-dependent communities on lower wages who travel the longest distance and spend the greatest proportion of their income on transport who experience the greatest disruption when transport services are not resilient. And so I really think that transport resilience has to be integrated within sustainable urban development, within sustainable urban mobility, and how we design and operate our cities moving forward. I think if you think about how people move around the city and get that right, then you're already improving the resilience of your transport system. And so I really advocate for transport resilience, not just to be with the engineers and the transport managers, but it has to be part of municipal planning strategies, housing, public services, and commercial and industrial development, so that we can co-locate. For example, we can co-locate affordable housing and employment opportunities and get people moving around our cities in a better way, which is efficient for transport, but ultimately it serves the users of the transport. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And now, John, could you share some examples of people-centred approaches towards building resilient transport infrastructure, please?
Thanks, Anne. And it's really, I've got to say, Emma, it's great following you, because it's really easy to connect into the things that you've just said, because for our people-centred approach, and the example I'm going to give today is very much looking at the communities as a whole. So what we're doing at the moment within our resilience strategy is we're evaluating all of our geospatial information from local governments, from transport, and all the different components of that. But we're also overlaying flood modelling, we're overlaying fuel load predictions for bushfires, flood predictions, urban heat islands, where we can, Emma, with your greening of things, certainly for us, we have some areas in New South Wales that need to take down that heat quite substantially, and other threats. And we're looking at holistically around the communities and saying, it's not just a transport problem. What are the things we need to do that's going to have the biggest impact on the community? So government has started to fund, as a block of funding, looking at how we can improve the resilience overall of the communities themselves. And transport is just one component of that. And I think, who'd have thought transport people would be doing flood modelling? And then we've got people who are also now doing climate change analysis. And those connections are really now starting to lead us down into local government. And I think the connection of the levels of government is critical to the success of the people-centred approach here. So for us, our approach is looking at it from emergency situations, but as Emma said also, we're building a lot of new infrastructure in New South Wales. We're putting a new airport in, and we're putting new train lines and metro lines to that airport. So there's a lot of quick rethinking around some of that over the last couple of years to test the resilience of that and whether we've actually got what's in the best interests of communities. And we've had to adapt some of what we were going to do to better suit the future needs of the community. So those connections between the transport infrastructure, what people actually want to do. So COVID has taught us people aren't moving to the same places they used to move. So the way in which our transport system needs to be adaptable. So for the next 100 years, pretty hard to adapt a rail network without having some flexibility or ways in which you can then modify that using buses, light rail, and micro mobility options to get people to move around their cities more holistically. So I think for me, Anne, it's very much the people-centred nature of it is actually forcing us to get out of our silos and not just think about transport. It's how do people get to education, how do people get to work, not just through what you would traditionally think as the rail or road networks, but people are using all sorts of other modes to get to those places of work. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, John. And now, Dr. Susan.
Yeah.
Could you please share some examples of people-centred approaches towards building resilient transport?
Yeah, I'd like to share one example. That is our work on inclusive design and design for people with disabilities, and that's something that we are focusing on a lot in the last couple of years, especially in our transport and especially urban transport areas. So maybe that's something we need to consider. especially if you consider also aging populations in many of the developing countries. Another aspect, and actually I've been involved in one of those myself, is really what happens if a disaster hits this infrastructure. So I had been 3 years ago, actually caught in the metro in Manila during an earthquake. And I think that's then also when you really realize how deficient many of these infrastructure assets are in terms of getting access in and out, or even if there are injuries or health issues. So what we are doing now is increasingly also stress testing these kind of infrastructures. And again, I think the role of scenarios comes in there, which helps people to rethink the design and really have rethought about all these different design structures, you know, from access for disabled people, but also injured people, and in case there are any health emergencies happening.
Thank you. So thank you very much to Emma, John and Susan for that first part of our dialogue today. I'd now like to move to the airports. Now, CDRI has a global study on disaster resilience of airports, and there's a project that they're currently undertaking which aims to document an inventory of natural and man-made hazards that airports are exposed to, provide an airport risk index for measuring the exposure, vulnerability and adaptive capacity of airports in the face of natural and man-made hazards, detail a set of recommendations for policymakers based on the lessons learned from airports that have recently faced disasters, and give an understanding into the incorporation of disaster risk in financing airport investments. And we have a panel of Graham Bolton, Andrea Giordano and Vivek to discuss some of the issues around airports. So I'd like to introduce Graham Bolton. Graham Bolton is the Global Practice Leader Aviation for Mott MacDonald, and he's the Vice Chair of the British Aviation Group. He has an engineering background and he has over 30 years experience in aviation, including strategic planning, capital development and business transformation programs for major airports across Europe, GCC, East Asia, Australasia and North America. He brings insight into global airport development activity and industry trends, with experience of working with industry leaders, global industry bodies and government representatives. He is actively involved in initiatives on sustainable aviation and future flight through work and policymakers, industry groups, global clients and academia. He is currently supporting the work of CDRI as a member of the Advisory Steering Committee for this global study on disaster resilience of airports. So I will pose the first question on the transition and the future of the aviation infrastructure. Over to you, Graham, if you would like to give us some comments on that.
Thank you. So really excited to be part of this panel, and it's for me it's a really exciting, important topic. I think disaster resilience is not a new challenge for airports. As long as I can think of flying, there's been challenges in terms of any and every form of natural disaster that's impacted us. I hark back to the year of 2010 when we had both severe weather. I think Heathrow was hit by the coldest December for 100 years, as were many other airports in Northern Europe, and we took a lot of lessons from it. It was also the year of the Icelandic volcano. And I remember being stuck, and many of us trying to find ways back across the world when large parts of world airspace, particularly European, but also North Atlantic American airspace, were impacted. But I think it's something that, whilst we've lived with it and found ways of responding, it's becoming increasingly important because of both climate and other risks, as we've seen with the impact of pandemic in the last year or two. What's really key to me is to say is understanding the breadth of risks that we might need to consider. It's very easy for us to respond to the latest problem, and it's very important that we take an approach that says we learn from the last challenge and apply that learning to the wider challenges we're going to face in terms of resilience. I think we're doing it at a time when the industry is being challenged commercially, that all stakeholders in the industry are finding things difficult, both in terms of their financial position, but also actually access to to people. There's a global challenge in terms of resource and capability for the industry, not helped by the loss of people we've had over the last 2 years. So how do we build resilient systems against that context? The key point across all this, though, is that we are a global network, that we've seen in every instance of disruption that it has impact across the global network, and therefore having a global response, being able to learn from each other is critical. This isn't an area where we get competitive advantage one airport to another or one stakeholder to another. It's about an area where collaboration, sharing of best practices is fundamental. And in that context, I think the study and the work that's being done to form a framework from which we can say, how do we get better collectively, is something that's massively important for us as airports. And it's massively important for the communities that we support globally, the people who rely on airports, as we heard earlier, for access to education, to health, to their economic well-being.
Thank you, Graham. Yes, collaboration is a very important aspect here. Now I'd like to move to the second person in this section, Mr. Andre Giordano. Andrea is the head of the PMO, Investments, Mobility and Hydraulics Modelling and Development BU Infrastructures at the Aeroporti di Roma, SPA. He graduated from Roma Tre University in Rome. He has a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering. He's worked with RFI, a company that manages rail infrastructures in Italy. He also worked for an engineering company where he gained skills in the airside improvement design and drainage systems. In 2004, he worked on updating the Bologna Airport Manual on the occasion of runway extension and taxiway improvement. In 2005, he supervised the Bologna-Verona railway doubling construction works for a building company. And since 2006, he has been working for Aeroporti di Roma in the infrastructure development sector. In 2013, he became responsible for drainage development and planning, mobility and land use. And currently he is head of the PMO, Investments, Mobility and Hydraulics Modelling and Development, and involved in the Rome Master Plan and General Planning, focusing on airport access systems improvement, CapEx and drainage assessment. Over to you for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Anne, and a lot of description, but it's my work, it's my job. Well, thank you for the occasion to speak about the transition of the future of transport infrastructure, in particular for airports. As you know, pandemic has hit the aviation industry a lot. It's probably never before in the history. So the sector has wondered how to react in this situation, looking at the future, and above all in that way, with a view of recovery and general transition, that see climate change as an essential element to be considered. And that's the way that we follow. You know, behind my screen there is Aeroporti di Roma, that is the K-port. We named the K-port, not the airport, but the K-port with the earth, no? Because in our vision, the best strategy for airport is continue to invest in the future with the goal of the carbonization and net zero carbon. We meet the goal that is within 2030, Rome airports has carbon zero, and based on sustainability, quality and innovation as essential pillars to be implemented, perfectly integrated in every aspect of the business of the aviation. So from green finance and infrastructure development to circular economy to social sustainability, with a strong focus also of our people and our community, because airport has matched the needs from each side and from the other side and then the surroundings, as you know. For instance, how we can do this with green finance? Because, for instance, Rome Airports has become the first airport to place a sustainability-linked bond with key performance index that we have to measure, and so it's a big challenge that we keep in touch, even because we want to have a primary role in the aviation development. In terms of what we can do, what we are going to do, obviously we make concentration on renewable sources, given that the airport itself is highly energy-intensive infrastructures. Taking account the Ukraine war, the energy is completely a big challenge that everyone has to be to think. Use of fuel for aircraft derived by sustainable sources. We are now implementing a sustainable aviation fuel especially with a partnership with airlines and the major players in Italy that can help each other to go fast forward in this big challenge. And focus on digital innovation is one of the important things. I heard something from Giorgio. It's very important because we are going to have seamless process. There are energy saving process itself. And so what we look at this kind of resilient issues. For us, a resilient airport, in our vision, is an airport that first reacts to climate change by actively reducing as much as possible the contribution that airport generates on the climate, and then, just then, mitigate the effects through appropriate management and infrastructure measures. This will lead to the true infrastructure transition of the future. And as I said, green finance can help airports in this way a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I like the focus on the finance as well, so bringing that aspect in. Now to the third panel member in this section, I turn to Mr. Vivek Sindhamani. Now, Vivek is a leading professional in sustainable aviation and a lead at NACO, a company of Royal Haskins. He has a Master of Science in Aerospace Engineering from Delft University of Technology. And Vivek's current focus is on spearheading the global aviation sustainability and resilience conversation and delivering tangible solutions to the clients, especially in airport resilience, and in close collaboration with the resilient experts and using innovative digital solutions. He is a member of various aviation committees, such as the ACI World Environment Standing Committee, the ICAO Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection Working Group 2, and the IATA Global Think Tank Working Group. I give you the floor, Vivek, to provide some opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Anne, for that introduction. It's an honor to be part of this panel, mostly talking about climate resilience. As already started by Graham, it's all about the impact on the climate change on airport operations and infrastructure. So it's all related to the physical risk aspects. And then Andreas touched upon the importance of decarbonization. So that's where I think I'm trying to bring that aspect today, is more to talk about the transition risk. So as of now, as a part of the climate resilience, so we always focus on the physical risk of side of things. That's quite important in terms of disaster response. At the same time, aviation, as we all know, that it is being hit hard by the pandemic, but it is revamping faster than expected. So we might expect around the traffic will be doubled by 2050. In that sense, that we have higher challenge to decarbonize, meaning that there are a lot of transition needs to take place. Given that the industry has already signed up for net zero by 2050, so airports and airlines, so that brings a roadmap approach. So that not only one solution is going to solve this. So we have to think about how these solutions, which are in the transition phase, will also be embedded in the airport planning, for instance. So that brings a greater challenge. So that's also part of climate change. And so in that sense, that in the next discussion, I can already talk about the anticipated changes. So how that will impact the airport infrastructure. How can airport be more ready to adapt to those changes at the early stages, rather than spending a lot of money at the later stage. So that's quite important to understand. So my key point here is to focus a lot on transition risk, not only on the physical risk at this stage as a part of climate resilience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. And thank you to the three, Graham, Andre, and Vivek, for those opening remarks. Now I'm going to move to the questions. And the first question is, what are the major changes anticipated in the aviation industry that must be considered while planning the disaster and climate resilience of airports? Graham, if you could start us off on that discussion, please.
Thank you. So I think I'd like to build on themes that have been well introduced by Andrea and Vivek. For me, there are three, perhaps four areas that I think are really significant change within the industry coming forward now. The first one is this move is absolutely the move towards net zero emissions, or potentially, you know, with the exception of the aircraft itself, I think we're looking much more towards a move towards zero emission for Scope 1 and ground-based Scope 3 emissions by, you know, maybe 2040 as an aspiration in some places, and we're seeing commitments towards that. The challenge that raises for us, of course, is the resilience of supply. That historically, if I was an airport operator and I had a cogeneration plant and backup generators running on diesel, I had quite a lot of resilience in an island mode against my system. But if I move towards a zero emission ecosystem where I might be linked into renewables that quite often are not on my site, I might be linked to a hydrogen hub that operates across that supports an intermodal network. I have perhaps less control of my ground-based infrastructure to support zero emission operations in the future. So I think we need to look again. It's looking at the system of systems. How do we generate a solution that is resilient, recognizing that actually at times of disaster, the airport itself it can be quite critical in terms of continuing to support the community needs. So how do we? That's for me. That's challenge number one. I think the second challenge is about the role of digital in the way we operate. And you know, there was the comment about digital twin earlier, and the importance of digital twin in the way we plan and operate, the importance of digital in terms of the way that we work collaboratively, the role it plays in future airspace. So if we look at airspace modernization, its reliance on systems for automation, for collaborative decision making, the way we use digital in the management of operations. We have a much greater reliance both on systems and not on people, and on systems that have got, again, a wide range of stakeholders involved in the planning and delivery. If we have data in the cloud, we have networks that run across countries which have got, you know, a number of potential breakpoints that are way outside our control or ability to interrogate. We have to look at, firstly, how do we put appropriate resilience into those networks? But equally, what are the people processes that we can use to respond when we don't have a fully manual process and we don't have people who are perhaps used to making the decisions in the way they would have done, you know, 5-10 years ago. I think the third one for me is about areas of growth. I've seen a statistic from some of the work we do more generally as Mott MacDonald that potentially 75% of global infrastructure for 2050 has yet to be built. And if we look at that, a large proportion of that infrastructure is going to be developed in markets, in developing economies where it's absolutely critical for their economic and social development. But potentially those are the locations where we've got, you know, greater issues in terms of climate resilience and perhaps other challenges. They're also potentially on land in locations which, you know, haven't been developed in the past because they're less suitable for use. And we have, therefore, potentially challenges just in terms of the suitability of where we're building. So we have to perhaps put greater focus on how do we look at all forms of resilience from, you know, obviously the climate-related activities, but also things like, you know, seismicity, suitability of ground, to make sure that future infrastructure serve the economies that we're working in, and recognise that actually, if you look at some places where we're building new airport infrastructure, the surrounding infrastructure in terms of ground transport, rail, road, maritime where appropriate, and energy infrastructure doesn't necessarily have the maturity that it would have done in the markets where historically we've been developing airports.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Andrea, do you have anything else that you'd like to add to Graham's remarks there?
Yes, I'm really very agree with Graham's point of view. Let me say that in aviation industry, especially obviously airports, the climatic context which they are located must be analyzed a lot. And this is the very first point to analyze. When you think about a resilient infrastructure, you have to think how resilient it must be, because the quantum is fundamental. Because you can have a big resilient infrastructure or a part of this, or more or less it depends on what you want. It's unlikely to make an airport resilient in its entirety, because normally airports are a set of infrastructures that have developed over time, of a lot of time, in our cases, 50 years, and with even different construction regulations. So to determine this threshold, the quantum of your resilience, airport has to decide what areas could be, for instance, operative or not, what time you could be operative or not. In which way? We use modeling, we use simulation tools, for instance, for flooding or drainage or rain events related to climate change, properly powered and calibrated with inputs that include climate change scenarios, because you can find in literature a lot of studies on this, and we compare this kind of inputs with the climate change, and we put inside our models in order to have the projected scenarios that allows us to have flooding, to see floodings in the airports, to see what areas are operative or not. As I saw before Emma that there's an iterative process on this. We made the same things because we have some option to be considered when you get simulation and we get models. And outputs are options made by this process, and we evaluate by key drivers that must be defined and scored by all stakeholders involved, external and internal of the airport. Because this can generate a ranking that, with different options, help you to evaluate the best option to have a resilient infrastructure when you have particular events related to the climate change. For instance, some key drivers could be effectiveness of the option considering the physical system, so time of interruption or vulnerability in case of the event of blackout of pumping station, let me say, or effectiveness in the management system. For instance, decision-making effectiveness, if people is coming where they come or not. Economics, obviously, long-term effects, and also physical system resilience as flexibility, resistance of the system, etc., etc. So these are the main key drivers that we score with our stakeholders. And then we have this ranking, and we chose the best solution related to the singular event. And we think that with this kind of planning, you can anticipate this change, and you can plan and manage the airport in the best way. Thank you.
Thank you. And Vivek, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, indeed. So building upon Graham's and Andrea's conversation on how can we adapt to these anticipated changes, like I mentioned earlier, I would like to share my screen for a moment to quickly go through what are the most anticipated changes apart from the climate. Please let me know if you see my screen now. Yeah, so if we look at this, so it's not only about looking at the change in the climate aspects, okay, how the weather pattern is changing. Apart from that, we also like to look at the trends that's in the aviation, moving more towards the decarbonization. So like Graham mentioned, that's not only about looking at the aircraft itself, but then in the end, it's also by looking at how to host these aircraft types. So there are three possibilities to move towards the decarbonization. One is, of course, looking into the aircraft itself, the electric or hybrid electric or hydrogen powered aircraft. At the same time, the other bigger piece is focusing on the operations and the infrastructure side of things, where I think where airport has more control, and then things are on ground when it comes to power supply, when it comes to in the future, it will be a hydrogen farm. And then at the same time, on the land side accessibility, it's not only we are talking about the buses, but also the future air mobility that comes into picture. So, and then these aspects is already airports are thinking, like what Andreas has mentioned about to achieve the decarbonization goal. So those brings the transition risks. So not only more looking into the investment side of things, but also it looks into the regulatory aspect of things. So it's still that is evolving. So we need to already include that as a part of our climate resilience planning to see what kind of regulation is going to change. So how it's going to impact. Sometimes it might end up in a litigation risk. So those things also need to be included as a part of the climate change adaptation plan. And then from the private perspective, as a private entity airport, for instance, they also need to justify their investment requirements to a third party. Then I think they also need to be obligatory or mandatory to also disclose the TCFD reporting as a task force for climate financial disclosure. So then I think they also need to explicitly mention how are they managing their physical and transition risk when it comes to the climate change. So those two aspects is quite important to understand and also take into account all these anticipated changes in the aviation industry when it comes to the decarbonization activities. So this is I would like to touch upon, maybe given one example. We all also focusing on the electrification of airside. At the same time, there is a lot of faith in hydrogen in aviation, which can be one of the solutions to help aviation decarbonize. That also comes with a lot of challenges in terms of transition. So there are different possibilities to bring hydrogen to the airport. So it's depending on the location of the airport and also the operation of the airport. So in that sense, that we need to clearly identify how the supply chain is going to get impacted, and then also the footprint is going to impact it in the master plan. So these are all the changes that we need to look into, and then also the cost aspects to it. And most importantly, the stakeholder dynamics will also change in future when we bring a new element into the airport ecosystem. So that is also needs to be catered. On top of all of that, again, coming back to the physical risks, whenever we want to host a new technology at an airport, that technology also needs to survive the physical risk, for example, sea level rise, extreme rainfall, and also storm and tornadoes. So that we also need to think about, because these new technologies, which is going to bring in, will also come up with the new design guidelines that needs to be aligned with the climate change parameters. So these are the things I think I feel that the anticipated changes in aviation industry needs to be addressed at the planning stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. And now I'd like to pose another question to Graham, Andre, and Vivek. How do we keep airports open in times of extreme events? Could you share some insights or examples in best practice from your experience on building infrastructure resilience? Graham, if you would like to answer that, please.
Yes, so I'd like to perhaps pick up two themes in this. I think the first is, how do we make sure that we've designed the infrastructure to be suitable for it? And I think that aligns with what Andrea was talking about earlier in terms of the modeling, the design. And I'd like to link back to some work that's being done by Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, CCRI, that we've been involved with a number of others, that's looking at how we create a framework for integration of the physical climate risk into planning. So it's developing a structured methodology that allows us to look at how do I understand what could be the physical climate risk, and how do I prioritize which areas I should be looking at in my planning, my design, and equally in my asset management and operation. So it is building up, says, actually, have I got the right data set? Do I understand what data is significant to do the evaluation? To do a materiality assessment, it's very easy for us to look at all of the areas of the operation, but just said which areas really matter. So which are the areas that are most critical in terms of the impact on my performance and or my stakeholders and or my investment? To then be able to do a structured review of options and to back it up by an environment, an economic, financial, and you could add to that a social impact assessment to understand how it plays through. So I think we found that creating that model and that methodology is due to be published fairly shortly that people can use to say, actually, how do I work through this in a clear way? That starts by saying, I'm not throwing money at all the problems. I'm taking a very measured, structured approach to get best value from the way I build my infrastructure. But I think equally important, and that's what we've seen repeatedly in terms of the way people are able to respond or not respond to disaster, whether it's climate resilience or any other form of disaster, is about having robust command control processes. And for me, what's interesting is actually there's quite a strong correlation between having robust command control processes for regular operations and the ones that we would need to use in irregular operations. So it's built upon things like having a single version of the truth. Everybody we have a common set of data to understand what's happening across the operation. We don't run off 15 different sets of reports produced by different people from different input data. That is supported by things like digital infrastructure that says I've got good data collection, but actually it's not reliant on it. It's about having clear lines of command so that when things start going wrong, we can make a single controlled decision. And it's very clear that that's backed up by a proper escalation process of bronze, silver, gold that says the person in command is in command, and actually it doesn't matter who else you are. In my mind, if you have if you're accountable in the duty role for the airport, even if the chief exec taps you on the shoulder and says, I'd like you to do something different, if you are in command until you're relieved of the command, you run the airport. And it's having that clarity of purpose and doing that, being able to do that in a multi-stakeholder environment. So you have the stakeholders co-located, whether it's physically or virtually, so you can make that informed decision and you can communicate with others involved, which means when we start to get to the issues that said, I've got a crisis, my power supply has gone out, I've got disruption on the road and rail network, you can make informed decisions that don't have knock-on consequences. That it's great, I clear a road blockage and I create a problem in my check-in hall, or I throw everyone at the check-in hall and remove the queues, and it just moves them to security. So you start looking at it as a balanced solution across stakeholders, and that allows us to respond to whatever the different levers are. And that approach applies whether we've got problems in security because the staff haven't turned up, or we've got industrial action, or we've got a volcano. That same approach of structured decision-making, collaborative approach based on common data works in pretty much every environment. So for me, those would be the two things: making sure we've designed the infrastructure properly in the first place with a risk-based approach, and then we've got a proper command control structure that helps us operate it effectively.
Thanks, Graham. That sounds like you have outlined the principles of a good asset management system there. And now I'd like to ask Andrea. How do you keep airports open in times of extreme events?
Well, I'm totally agree. First, I'm totally agree with Graham thinking. So in the plan and design phase, it's very important to have a strong, as I said before, a strong simulation models that allows you to see what are made possible in terms of defining areas with controlled flooding, for instance, or balancing flooding between a system or another one, or using drainage network as a rolling basing, etc. In our case, models helps us a lot to make decision and to keep our airport open, because these kind of solutions that we implement in the planning and in design phase, it's properly fitted for procedures and communication that we made every day. With this output, we can also have a resilient airport, because to manage daily events arising from climate change, we have set up a task force. When we have an event different from a normal event that we have normally in the airport, in particular for raining, we made a task force with the main stakeholders, so a lot of stakeholder engagement in this case. And we have some bulletin that we share every day, proper bulletin and bulletin from aeronautical providers that we match together. We made a comparison to be sure to have the best scenario that is going to have in the airport. And then before the event, if we have an alert, we check all the network because we have sensor in the drainage network, and we check that all things runs well and all things goes well. If the event is particularly critical, we set up also a manpower task force just in order to look what we have to do in some different areas of the airport, because the airport is very, very large area, as you know. After that, we communicate to everybody what is the best scenario, let me say, best scenario that we have to follow in the case of this kind of events. And with this procedure, with communication, with a right communication with internal and external, very important, it's happened nothing, let me say. So it's a good way to go. So I totally agree with Graham. Plan and design with modeling and communication proceduralization for this kind of situation to keep airports open in case of climate change events. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Vivek.
Yeah, thank you. I will also like to continue the conversation. Also like to share my screen just to give some statistics. So as we all know that CDRI is conducting a survey on global resilience for airports. So through that research, I think what Graham mentioned, also Andreas, to focus on the planning aspect and design, and also more on the communication side of things. So Andreas mentioned about how it has been done on ground. So what we've seen from this initial exercise, this survey is still open, ongoing, and then I would encourage Asian airports, especially Indian airports, to respond to the survey. So what you see on the screen is based on 65 airports responded to those questions, how they see what kind of activities they do when it comes to keep the airport open in terms of extreme events. So this also includes resilience, not only for disaster events. As you can see, it's obvious the results are that all airports are focusing on the business continuity planning. It's more on the operational side of things. So you can read it from the bottom up. So like what Chaim mentioned about the planning and design aspects. So the bottom four is all focusing on the planning and design aspects. So how a first step is to include climate resilience as a part of the master plan, and then look into the assessment strategies through simulations, like Andreas mentioned at the early stages of the planning, to run through different scenarios, do the scenario analysis, try to see how to upgrade the plan. And then, for example, if an airport needs a seawall, that also needs to be reserved. So all kind of space reservations can be done at the early stages of the planning through these assessments with the help of simulation exercise. And once that has been done, and then the risk has been identified and studied, now I think is to set the design standards. That's where it's also moving more from the planning to the design stage. That's also most of the airports, they agree that, okay, this is quite important to do. And then when it comes to the regulation, so this also needs to be long lasting and then needs to be updated on a periodic basis. So once that has been done, then comes construction phase. So then the infrastructure upgrade needs to happen through construction, following all the things that are done in the planning and design stage. And then when it comes to operations, it's to focus on the business continuity planning. It's more how to respond to disaster events, taking into all these aspects what they have in place. So this clearly shows that airports are more currently focusing on the operation side of things. So now I think they also need to upgrade their planning and design stages when they want to do more extensions or when they want to look into green. So this gives a very good perception as of now, how it has been addressed right now. But in the moving on the future, it could be good that it can be other way around. So then that's basically insights that we found out from this ongoing survey. So that's what I would like to share on this topic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivek. Now we're getting close to the closing time. We can't run over time. I'd like to quickly run around each of the 6 panel members, and if they could give me in just one sentence some closing remarks, and then I would like to circle back to our esteemed keynote presenter, Mr. Giorgio Travani, to actually close the session with his summary. So Emma, over to you.
Thanks. I think in summary, the main principles required for building transport resilience systems, it's got to be people-centered, it has to be evidence-based, your design codes and standards need to be relevant, you need to monitor and review, adaptation is iterative, and it must be part of business as usual. Thank you.
Terrific, that's brilliant. And now I go to John.
Thanks, Anne. And not to regurgitate what Emma's just said, I think the other things I'd add to that is very much around collaboration. Make sure you're actually getting out and understanding what others are doing. So collaborating with people, but keeping the community or customer at the heart of everything you're doing to make sure that you're focused on the outcome, not on resilience itself, but the outcome you're trying to achieve through resilience. Thanks, Anne.
Right, that's brilliant. And Susan.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that all of this requires a lot of capacity development, institution building across various agencies, and of course, collaboration with the private sector. So some skills need to be enhanced and built, I think, there, especially on this public-private sector collaboration. And I would say this is some of the responsibility and role lies with the development partners, especially in developing countries, to make sure the capacity is built and the institutions are strong enough for this kind of collaboration that is required. And I like this term structured decision making, which I think also requires new kinds of skills. So it seems while we need engineering and a lot of technical sophistication, we need a lot of capabilities to make decisions as we go, adapt, collaborate, communicate. And maybe these are the 21st century skills we really need to build in many of the leaders.
You're on mute, Anne.
Thank you, John. Graham.
Yeah, so I would say my prime focus would be the integrated approach, but just in doing so to avoid, thinking about double jeopardy, recognize that actually multiple things can go wrong at once. We can't assume that only one thing's going to happen at the same time.
Thank you. And Andrea.
Yes, let me say, for us, a resilient airport is an airport that first reacts to climate change by activity reducing is as much as possible the contribution that the airport generates on the climate, and then mitigating its effect through appropriate and infrastructure measures. Build resilience by every day internally is our goal in this way. Thank you.
Thank you. And Vivek.
Yeah, for me, the closing remarks is when it comes to a sustainable and resilient airport, it's two things. When we look at the sustainable measures, those measures need to be resilient. At the same time, the resilient measures need to be sustainable. So I think this is the interlink that we have to focus at the early stages of the airport development process. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was a terrific summary of what we've been speaking about. Now, Mr. Giorgio Travani, would you be able to provide us with a summary, please?
Yes, certainly. So I think it was a very comprehensive discussion, and this is what I take it from this overall interaction and panel that you led. What I think it's a very, so the lessons learned I get is that we need to learn also from each other. So all the input given were taking different aspects. So from the aviation to the more theoretical one, to the strategic, etc., etc. But there is something in common, which is everybody has its own, let me say, view of what needs to be done for tackling the resilience in the most appropriate way. So we need to learn from these. What I would focus as well, and something that I retain also, is the fact that we're talking of a different type of resilience. So on climate, on cybersecurity, on the some speaker mentioned also on the issues that arise from the availability of the assets and so on and so forth. So I think it's an excellent forum, this one that has been organized already, to be able to discuss around it. And probably we need to go a further step. And this further step, I think it will be also putting that maybe into standards, maybe into common international actions that then everybody can implement in their own system, so that we have, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, a system of system approach where everything fit together.
Thank you. That's a terrific point to finish on. So thank you very much to Mr. Giorgio Trevani, to Emma, John, Susan, Graham, Andrea, and Vivek. Thank you very much for all the time and effort you put into this event and coming along and providing us your views in this dialogue. So we've reached our time of cutoff, and we'll see you all next time. Bye now.
We can tell it.